7 decades since the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, around 80 new fragments of the ancient texts have been revealed to the public.
If I tell you that a discovery from the desert caves of Israel has shaken not just history, but also faith, memory, and even hidden decisions, it might be hard for you to believe. This is not some ordinary archaeological discovery. The Dead Sea Scrolls shocked the entire world nearly 70 years ago, but now around 80 new fragments have come to light. These are pieces that many people believed were lost forever, but the most unsettling part is, maybe they were never truly lost. Maybe they were just waiting for the right time. These fragments are about 2,000 years old, broken, scattered, and so fragile that at first glance they look almost unreadable. Then in 2021, archaeologists risked their lives to enter a sealed and terrifying cave. And what they found was not just a part of a religious text, but something that may have been deliberately hidden. Then AI started connecting these silent fragments, and slowly the silence began to turn into words. And what emerged was not just history, it was a record of faith, memory, and hidden decisions. What you're about to hear in this video will make you think till the very end. So before we go deeper, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell notification. In 2021, archaeologists did not set out for a normal digging mission. They were actually going deep into history itself. The most interesting part is that they were not looking for ordinary things. They didn't want pottery or animal bones. They were searching for traces of voices that had been buried for centuries. And this place is officially called Cave 8, but people know it as the Cave of Horror. When archaeologists moved deeper inside the cave, what they found did not seem very big or special at first glance. There were small fragments of ancient texts buried there, so delicate that even the slightest wrong touch could turn them into dust. These were not complete manuscripts nor neatly wrapped scrolls, just scattered, broken fragments that had almost faded away with time. Orrin Abelman controlled expectations from the very beginning. He clearly said that this might not look like a big discovery in terms of size, but the truth is, size never really mattered here. The real story was hidden inside these tiny pieces. As he said, when these fragments are put together the right way, when they start speaking on their own. After this began an extremely difficult and patient process. The team matched the fibers of each piece, compared the ink patterns, and started assembling them like a jigsaw puzzle. The only difference was, most of the puzzle pieces were missing. Still, slowly, these fragments that had been separated for 2,000 years began to reconnect. In some places, faint letters started to appear, then words, and gradually full sentences came into view. What once looked like broken marks was now turning into a story. It felt as if the voices that time had buried were beginning to speak again. As the team moved further inside the cave, they came across something that left everyone completely silent for a few moments. Near the entrance of the cave, under two flat stones, something had been carefully hidden. At first, it seemed like it might be an old tool or some artifact, but when they looked closely, the truth was very different. It was the mummy of a child. The child was around 6 to 12 years old. The small body was placed in a fetal position, as if someone had gently put the child to sleep. The head and upper body were wrapped in cloth, while the legs were left uncovered. There was even a piece of cloth in the child's hands, as if they had fallen asleep holding it. There was no sign of hurry or panic in this burial. It felt like whoever did this took time, care, and truly cared about the child. When testing was done, it was revealed that these remains are around 6,000 years old, thousands of years older than the Dead Sea Scrolls themselves. The dry air of the cave preserved the body in such a way that it felt like time had stopped right there. The climate and burial method together froze this single moment forever. But the story doesn't end here. As the team went deeper, they discovered something else that was equally shocking. A large woven basket. This basket was almost completely intact, its fibers still strongly connected, with a storage capacity of about 100 liters. Analysis showed that it is around 9,000 years old, belonging to the Neolithic period, possibly the oldest basket ever found in the world. According to Orrin Abelman, this basket is not just an object, but proof that even at that time, humans were thinking about planning, storage, and the future. It belongs to the pre-pottery Neolithic B period, when humans were just beginning to settle down and organize their lives. Dead Sea Scrolls, bigger background and why they matter. Now, if you really want to understand this whole story properly, we have to go a little back, because the real story of the Dead Sea Scrolls doesn't start today, but in the late 1940s. It is said that a Bedouin shepherd, while searching for his animals, reached some caves and found a few strange fragments there. At that time, even he probably didn't realize what he had found. But that small discovery later turned into one of the biggest discoveries in history. Over the next nearly 10 years, hundreds of manuscripts were found from that same area. Some were almost complete, but most were broken into very small pieces, so tiny that some were no bigger than a fingernail. Scholars tried to piece all of them together, and most believe that they are connected to a Jewish community that lived near Qumran, often called the Essenes. Although this theory is still debated today, one thing is certain. There is no doubt about the importance of these texts. In total, the Dead Sea Scrolls include more than 900 ancient Jewish manuscripts, believed to date from around the 3rd century BCE to the 1st century CE. Most of them are written in Hebrew and Aramaic, but some texts are also in Greek. They were written on different materials like parchment, papyrus, and even copper. About 40% of these texts are biblical, meaning they are parts of the Bible. And the most important thing is that these are among the oldest biblical copies ever found. For example, the version of the book of Isaiah discovered here is nearly 1,000 years older than any previously known version. Just imagine, a form of the same book we read today appeared in front of us in such an ancient form. Apart from this, around 30% of the texts are Jewish writings that were not included in the official biblical canon, like the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees. And the remaining texts show the rules, beliefs, and daily life of a particular community of that time, how they lived, what they believed in, and how they maintained their unique identity. All of this together created a completely new picture for scholars. The way Judaism developed and the environment in which early Christianity emerged, our entire understanding of these things started to change. The biggest point that came out was that these texts were never fixed or static. Multiple versions of the same text existed. People debated ideas, edited them, and reinterpreted them over time. For some people, this consistency was reassuring, that even after so many years, much has remained the same. But for others, the differences were a bit unsettling because it raises a big question. What we know today, is it the full story or just a part of it? New 80 fragments in the Greek Scroll of the 12. Now let's come to the most interesting part of this entire discovery, the new 80 fragments that gave the whole story a new twist. In this excavation, around 80 different pieces were found. At first glance, they look like just small fragments, but when researchers carefully analyzed them, it was revealed that they are parts of the Scroll of the 12, also known as the Minor Prophets Scroll. This was not the first time such fragments had been found. In the 1950s, Bedouin shepherds in the Nahal Hever area had found similar pieces, which were later sold in Jerusalem. But what makes these new pieces special is not just their condition, but their language. These fragments were not written in Hebrew or Aramaic, but in Greek, which is quite rare for biblical scrolls found in the Judean desert. When researchers looked more closely at the writing, another interesting detail came out. This scroll was written by at least 2 different scribes. Each had their own distinct writing style, almost like 2 different people telling the same story in their own way. This made it clear that it wasn't the work of a single person, but involved multiple hands. And the biggest twist came when the text was compared with the standard Septuagint. It didn't match exactly. This means it wasn't just a simple copy, but a modified version, one that shows how different communities were preserving and interpreting Scripture in their own ways. Even the structure of the parchment matched previously found fragments, confirming that these pieces belonged to the same ancient scroll. When researchers began assembling them, they were able to read up to about 11 lines of text. In these lines, parts of the book of Nahum appeared, carrying a very strong and intense tone of divine judgment and power, almost like a warning being delivered. On the other hand, passages from Zechariah also emerged, which felt completely different. These spoke about moral responsibility, fairness, honesty, and restraint. There were warnings against false oaths, and also a message about rebuilding the community after exile. If you look at both together, a clear contrast appears. On one side, destruction and judgment, and on the other, restoration and rebuilding. It feels like two phases of the same story. First falling, then rising again. How modern technology entered the cave. Now this is where the most interesting turn in the story begins, because the real difference was not just that fragments were found, but how they were read. In earlier times, archaeologists could only try to understand such finds by physically piecing them together. But this time, technology completely changed the game. The cave had already been searched many times before, so most experts believed there was nothing important left to find. But in archaeology, one thing is very important: patience. And when that patience is combined with modern technology, even old secrets start to reveal themselves. That is exactly what happened here. One of the team's archaeobotanists noticed faint marks on a group of very small fragments, or at first glance they looked like nothing more than dust, as if there was nothing there at all. But when examined closely, faint traces of ink began to appear, like letters trying to form. There were no complete words, no clear text, but it was enough to change the entire story. These fragments survived for nearly 2,000 years because the environment of the cave was extremely dry and isolated. Even a little moisture would have destroyed them long ago. So this was not just a discovery, it was also a story of survival. This finding created a new wave of excitement among scholars. But at the same time, there was a big problem. Touching these fragments was extremely risky. One small mistake, and whatever remained could be lost forever. So this time, the strategy was completely changed. Direct handling was minimized, and machines were given more responsibility. Each fragment was scanned under different types of light: normal light, infrared, and ultraviolet. Every wavelength revealed something different. The ink that looked almost invisible to the human eye suddenly became visible in these scans. In other words, where human eyes had given up, technology was able to see what had remained hidden for 2,000 years. AI, OCR, deep learning, and the hidden human hand. Now the real turning point of this story begins from here, when AI enters this entire discovery. Earlier, people thought these fragments would simply be joined together and read, but what actually happened went far beyond that. Here, OCR, optical character recognition, was used, but not the kind we use today to scan books or printed pages. This was a special system, trained specifically to read ancient writing. This system started recognizing Greek letters, early forms of Hebrew, and uneven handwritten strokes. Each letter was slowly reconstructed, stroke by stroke, like someone piecing together a broken voice. Once all these fragments were digitized, they were fed into deep learning systems. But the most interesting thing here was that AI was not just looking for words, it was understanding patterns. It compared handwriting styles, studied layouts, analyzed the texture of ink, and even examined stitching techniques. And from here, some surprising things began to emerge. Some fragments clearly belonged together. Not just the text, but even the structure of the parchment, the behavior of the ink, and the rhythm of the writing matched. And this showed that these were not random pieces. They were part of organized writing workshops. That means even in distant regions at that time, people were working with planning and structure. But the real shock came when AI started reading the human hand behind the writing. Every letter carries a subtle motion: the angle of the stroke, the pressure applied on the line, the slight pause before a curve. All these together form a kind of fingerprint. Some letters were slightly tilted, some became thinner in the middle, and some showed heavier pressure at the edges. One particular fragment connected to the Book of Nahum had writing that looked very uneven and hurried, as if it had been written in a rush due to lack of time. But AI went even deeper and detected tiny vibrations within the ink. Micro-tremors. And this is where questions started to rise. Was the writer old? Was he sick? Was he injured? Or was he writing in fear? Hiding somewhere, racing against time to record these words. Maybe he was escaping some danger. Maybe he knew these words had to be preserved, no matter what happened. AI didn't just tell us what was written, it also showed the condition in which it was written. And this is the most emotional part of the entire discovery. These scrolls were not written calmly in a safe place. They were likely written in moments when people had everything to lose and only words left to save. Now from here, the story becomes even more interesting, because for years a simple theory had been accepted, that all the Dead Sea Scrolls were the work of a single community, often called the Essenes, who lived around Qumran. This theory sounded clean and simple, but the reality may be far more complex. As soon as AI began analyzing these fragments deeply, the entire picture started to change. The texture of the ink, the weave of the parchment, stitching methods, and handwriting patterns all showed small differences and some unusual similarities. And most importantly, these texts were not only in Hebrew or Aramaic, but were also found in Greek and Paleo-Hebrew script. Paleo-Hebrew was usually used for divine names or special sacred emphasis. Now the real question arises here. These fragments were not limited to Qumran. They were also found in different locations like Wadi Murabat and the Cave of Horror. This means it was not the work of just one place. It was spread across multiple locations. So was this really the work of one isolated group, or was something much bigger going on? When AI compared regional writing styles and language variations, a new pattern started to appear. Many fragments that were found miles apart showed very similar methods of preparation and copying. The way the parchment was treated, the style of applying ink, the stitching techniques, everything matched in a surprisingly consistent way. In some fragments, it was clearly visible that deliberate corrections had been made, ink had been reapplied in certain places, and in some areas stitching had been done in a hurry. All of this made one thing clear. This was not calm, scholarly work done at leisure. This was work done in urgency. Now, many researchers believe that this was a coordinated effort to preserve sacred knowledge, especially around 70 CE, when the Second Temple was destroyed. And people didn't just flee with their families and belongings. They also carried these texts with them. Some were taken along desert routes, and others were hidden inside caves. Just imagine that scene. Scribes packing scrolls quickly in the light of torches, people escaping from Roman patrols, and some carefully sealing these texts under stones, hoping that time itself would protect them. Today, with AI and archaeology working together, it is becoming clear that this was not scattered chaos. It was a deliberate act of preservation, a hidden network working to keep these words alive. Now, this is where the story becomes even more complicated, because what started coming out was not just history, but something that directly puts faith into question. When AI imaging and advanced linguistic modeling were used, researchers didn't just see the words. They began to understand the damage patterns as well. And this is where things started to feel a bit strange. Earlier, it was believed that the damage on the scrolls was just due to time, random wear and tear. But when studied closely, certain patterns appeared again and again. Cracks were repeatedly found around specific sections, and some entire portions were consistently missing. It began to feel like this was not completely accidental. The biggest question arose when some major biblical books were simply not found, like the Book of Esther and the Book of Chronicles. Both are considered important, so why are they missing here? Were they just lost, or were they deliberately removed? And the story doesn't end there. Some Greek fragments do not match the traditional Septuagint at all. Oh, they mention events and characters that had never been heard of before. In some passages, even the tone seemed to shift. Where earlier there was divine command, now there appeared to be communal decision-making. In some texts, the mention of central worship was reduced, and instead more emphasis was placed on community rituals. And the most shocking part, some sections connected to messianic hope were either softened or completely removed. In their place, there was more focus on moral collapse, community responsibility, and warnings about survival. Now the question was, were these just writing mistakes? But AI analysis suggested something else. These did not look like random errors. In many places, the writing style suddenly changed, as if different voices were speaking within the same scroll. The texture of the ink changed. The rhythm of the language shifted, almost like the voice of the story itself had changed midway. From this, one thing started to become clear. This was not a single, unified belief system. It was a mix of different groups. Some people were still waiting for a savior, while others were focused only on survival. Some held tightly to tradition, while others were adapting religion to a changing world. Slowly, these scrolls stopped being just religious documents. They became a record of change. They became evidence of people who were actively deciding what to preserve and what to let go. And this is where the biggest question emerges. Have sacred texts always been the way we see them today? Or have they also changed over time, evolving with history itself? Maybe this is the point where history and faith collide and force us to think about what the truth really is. Now, as we reach the end of this entire story, one thing becomes absolutely clear. This was not a perfect, neatly arranged library that simply survived unchanged over time. It was actually a collection of voices of different people, shaped by fear, urgency, politics, survival, and their own decisions. When AI compared these fragments with known versions like the Septuagint, the Masoretic text, and the Samaritan Pentateuch, cracks began to appear in many places, cracks that were hard to ignore. At that time, there was no fixed concept of one Bible. In different places, different people were writing, understanding, and passing things forward in their own ways. And this is where the biggest questions arise. What sources were these scribes actually copying from? Who decided which text was sacred and which was not? In some places, commandments were explained differently. In others, history was rearranged in new ways. And in some passages, it even felt like divine authority had been replaced by collective decision-making, as if people were deciding together what was right. The Greek fragments made things even more surprising. They mentioned new characters and unfamiliar events that do not appear in traditional texts. In some texts, central worship was reduced and more importance was given to community practices. And in some places, creation was not shown as a calm, divine process, but as a cosmic struggle, as if everything emerged through conflict. And this brings out a very important point. Sacredness was never completely fixed. It kept changing with each generation. People preserved it, interpreted it in their own way, and adapted it whenever needed. Then one particular Greek fragment added even more depth. It hinted at the pre-existence of Christ. This is the same idea that later becomes very important in early Christian theology. For example, in John 1:1-18, Christ is described as the Word existing from the beginning. In John 1:15 and 1:18, his prior existence is emphasized, and in John 17:5 and 17:24, his glory before creation is mentioned. Paul's letters, Ephesians, 2 Corinthians, Galatians, and Colossians, also seem to support this idea. The Nicene Creed, which forms a major foundation of mainstream Christian belief, strengthens this concept further. Scholars like Bernard Ramm and James Dunn have also considered these ideas central to understanding Christology. At the same time, Tertullian's Against Marcion, the concept of theophany, and thinkers like W. Terry Whalen and Thomas Aquinas have approached these questions from different perspectives. But the most interesting part is that the Dead Sea Scrolls show us that these debates did not start later. They were already happening at that time, even before doctrine was officially defined. This means ancient communities themselves were struggling with these questions. What is truth? What is God? And where does humanity stand within it? And this is where the deepest meaning of this entire story emerges. These scrolls do not just confirm history, they challenge it. They show that sacred texts were not created all at once, but were shaped slowly through debate, danger, politics, and human struggle. But this does not mean that faith becomes weaker. In fact, it can feel even more real, because now it is not just divine, but also human. In the end, what remains is not just the record of a perfect book, but the story of people who tried to preserve meaning even in a collapsing world. And maybe this is the biggest question this discovery leaves us with. Dead Sea Scrolls have not just changed history, they have forced us to ask what truly is sacred and how much humans are willing to change in order to protect it. If you enjoy such mysterious and knowledge-filled videos, then subscribe to the channel right now so you don't miss any upcoming discoveries and can see every big reveal first.